Hi, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. Throughout the month of June, I'm doing this special mini-series where I'm interviewing a few of my own professors from the Maryland Institute College of Art, where I just finished graduate school, to talk to them about their own work and their thoughts on design and writing and criticism, and how studying with them has influenced this podcast and my own thoughts around all of these subjects. Today's episode is the second episode in this series, and it is a really thoughtful conversation with Abraham Burickson. Abe can be sort of hard to define. He's an architect, but he's also a writer and a poet and a performance artist, and has been my writing professor for the last 2 years. In this conversation, Abe and I talk about his background and thinking about architecture as less about buildings and more about these containers for experiences and how that influences his work and all these other disciplines. We talk about his performance group Odyssey Works, which is this really, really fascinating endeavor that creates these durational performances for a single person. And then we close the conversation talking about writing and structure and form and all of these things that we both love talking about. I've taken a few writing classes with Abe during my time in grad school and have honestly learned just so much from him about everything from art and the creative process to writing and editing and poetry. And I'm seriously a better writer because of him. And my thesis project is a better project because of his input and him pushing me to go deeper and further into my interests in design criticism. I am truly honored to have gotten to study with him and so thankful for his guidance and for this conversation. So I hope you'll enjoy this glimpse into the mind of another one of my favorite professors, Abe Burickson. I was thinking about this morning about kind of how I wanted to structure this conversation. I wanted to frame it in you do a lot of different things. You're an architect, writer, teacher, poet, performance artist. Is there any? Did I miss anything?
I'm renovating my house.
Renovating house.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the most diverse set of projects of anyone that I've talked to. And so I kind of wanted to start with kind of framing those a little bit, and just very briefly a little bit of that kind of history of how all those things started or came together.
Yeah. I mean, geez, it sounds like a mess, right? It
Yeah.
sounds like I just can't focus.
Yeah.
And I think and maybe we can come around to this, but I think the frame around it is a way of thinking that I'm trying to work with.
Okay.
Which perhaps finds its root best in architecture.
Okay.
You might say that it's an architectural design approach to all those other things that you list.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And the reason that it comes from that is that when you're designing a building, or at least for me, but I think for a lot of the architects whose work that I love and respect and have inhabited in ways that have moved me, you know that you're not creating a thing, right? Architects don't really design buildings. In a certain sense, they're designing everything but the building itself, right? The building is a container for the life that is lived within the building. My father, who was not an architect, used to say the most important thing about the building is the emptiness, right? Because if it's not empty, you can't enter into it.
Right.
And this was a provocative thing that I always thought about, right? The building is there to catalyze certain types of experience.
Right.
right?
Right.
And that manifests in many ways, right? The building it catalyzes the program, right?
Yeah.
The living, the sleeping, the entertaining,
Right.
the public and private program, all this stuff is made possible by the form. The form doesn't matter, right? Likewise, you think about it in
Yeah.
terms of like energy, in terms of material usage, right? The building is a moment in the energy profile of the city, for instance, right? You sort of drop it into the city, and it doesn't live discreetly on the site. It catalyzes a certain change in the city,
Right.
right, or
Yeah.
in the country, and that changes energy, that changes water, electric, whatever, and it's also patterns of movement. It's also you put this building that we're in here down where it is, and it looks a certain way. Everybody's focused on that, but it also does things to the way traffic moves, to the way people walk, to the way people think, to the way people see the city. Right? It's all about what the building does.
Yeah.
And for me, that's a way of thinking about any art form. I don't see why architecture is discrete in that way, right? So when I write, I'm thinking about what the writing does. Right? When I write a poem, very interesting. All the terms of poetry. Poetry means structure.
Right. I was thinking about that. Yeah.
Right? So all these terms come from something else, right? And so you're building a structure, and it's a structure of experience. And what is poetry? I mean, we've got a lot of sort of romantic ways of thinking about it, but in a certain sense, it's making art out of the grammar of language, right? And that does something, right? And we know that because it's done things to us.
Right.
If it hasn't, why the hell would we ever read poetry? It doesn't make any sense. But at a certain point, it has done something.
Yeah.
And so I've sort of found my way through these all my life, just sort of wondering why it is that I'm thinking in this weird way about stuff that's always presented as a discrete thing, like a poem is something that has line breaks. And so it seemed to me that many things could be that. And so this kind of coalesces in my larger project, which is Odyssey Works, where I create ostensibly the form. The form is these long-term experiences for one-person audiences, and they can be 24 hours long, 36 hours, a week, 2 weeks, 3 months, etc. But what it is an opportunity for me to work with artists across the disciplines in thinking this way. Right. And it's sort of a design approach to performance.
See, this is interesting to me because whenever I think about questions that I'm going to ask people, I always kind of make up answers in my head or try to anticipate what I think they're going to say. And I did not think that architecture was the thread that was going to connect all of those things. I was expecting it to be writing or language. And so I'm curious, I just kind of want to put this into a bit of into an order. You studied architecture in undergrad?
Mm-hmm.
And so were you thinking about architecture in that way when you were in school, or kind of where did that start to come together for you?
Well, when I was a kid, I wanted to be an architect. But
okay. I didn't know that.
But I was always writing. But when I was in school, my freshman year, I left college because, you were talking about going off on tangents.
Okay.
Can you go off on a tangent?
Go for it. Yeah, go for it.
Can I tell you why? So I went to the Church of St. John the Divine in New York, where they have these performances, fantastic place. And I saw a performance of the Mevlevi dervishes, the whirling dervishes.
Okay.
And it blew my mind. And I said, I need to do that. I need to learn how to do that. There was something in the form that spoke to me.
Yeah.
And I had a lot of questions about form in a lot of ways at that time. And that's another conversation. So I left
This,
school.
this is freshman in college.
Yeah.
Okay, so you had this experience, and then
So I
Okay.
left school. I went to New York, made money any way I could, which happened to be sort of faking my way through being a graphic designer.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and there's lots of stories there.
I didn't know this.
Yeah, and then I went to, and then I got in with the dervishes in New York and got a letter of introduction. Showed up in Turkey at the Whirling Dervishes Lodge and studied with them,
Okay.
and that was, I spent quite a while with the dervishes.
Okay.
And while I was there, in a state of mind that is conducive to it, I did a lot of walking. I did a lot of walking in the city, and Istanbul is an incredible city to walk in, and I always would end up in these mosques, among them the Hagia Sophia, one of the most amazing buildings in the world, and the Blue Mosque, and several other mosques, and the hammams. And I was in a particular state, having whirled with the dervishes and spending all my time with them. That was particularly receptive, but I walked into random mosques every day and hammams, and every time I did it, I felt myself completely transformed. Right? It was shocking, actually. It was shocking that the form of the space could change who I knew myself to be.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
I mean, this is the power, this is design, right?
Yeah,
This was designed. And it wasn't just like, okay, squares do this to me, but a certain narrative around what this was part of it, right?
Right.
And I understood a little, and later in my studies, I understood much more, right? It's about orientation. It's about creating this image of the world, this imago mundi that places you just so, right? That puts you in this kind of perfect world so that you understand what your role is in the cosmos, right? Relative to this way of seeing things. The mosque did that to me. Right. And I later traveled to Jerusalem and experienced some of the architecture there, especially the Dome of the Rock. Also the very, very powerful moment that the Wailing Wall is. And when I got home, I knew I needed to become an architect, but I needed to become an architect because of this power that it had. And this power was, it's so obvious, right? Once you start seeing it, it's so obvious. And it took me a while longer to see that this power was in writing, right? And this power is in live performance, right? Suddenly, every time I went anywhere and was affected by anything, it became clear that I needed to dig into how the design was structuring my experience.
Right.
You know, and this was a very different way. You know, all my teachers were teaching me about the thing. The building, the thing, or the poem. You know, the poem, it's a thing, it's a villanelle, it's a sonnet, it does this. And it kept striking me that it's not the thing. The play is not the thing.
Like it's in service of this other experience that someone else or a group of people will have in relation to that thing.
Exactly.
Interesting.
And so all my work has been in service of exploring that and trying to find ways to make to make the thing be understood and designed as the catalyst rather than the thing itself.
Right.
Which is what some of architecture is about, right? Some of architecture education and some architecture itself just clearly presents this. You know, you hear some, like, I recently read Peter Zumthor's Thinking Architecture.
Okay.
Such a perfect example of this.
Yeah.
You know, so that's kind of how it all fits together for me.
Yeah, I mean, that actually makes a lot, I don't want this to sound weird, but it makes a lot more sense than I was expecting it to. Because to list out those things, they sound, architect, poet, teacher, performance artist, sound like separate tracks. So I'm curious, do you, and you kind of mentioned this a little bit, but I kind of want to pull that apart a little bit more. Do you approach each of those things? Do you feel like you're coming to each of those things differently? Or I guess I don't know exactly how to phrase this. I kind of want to talk about the process a little bit, but do you kind of have these ideas and then think, this is a performance, this is a poem, this is a diagram or a building, or is it kind of, what comes first, I guess is.
Well, to have that freedom to be that way,
Yeah.
that's why I work with Odyssey Works.
Okay.
Right? Because, I guess with poetry, you can always write a poem, right? It doesn't matter.
Right.
Nobody's reading them anyway, right?
Right.
But with architecture, you have a client, you have a set of
Mm-hmm.
constraints. It's a little different, so you don't get that freedom.
Yeah.
But with Odyssey Works, it's carte blanche on that. And so then in that context, yes, I do.
Okay.
In fact, there are structures that I've been working with that that help make that possible, and that's actually been the large arc of the experiment that Odyssey Works is for me.
Yeah.
There's a lot of other people involved in it,
Right.
And so for other people, there are various different openings for them,
Right.
and it's in a way carte blanche for people to experiment in different ways. But I've been working on it a long time.
Yeah.
And so there are certain structures that I've set up that allow for that.
And there's that word structures.
Absolutely.
Again, too.
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
a structure because it allows for
Right.
that to happen, right?
Right.
What else is a structure, right? It supports.
Yeah.
It supports
Yeah.
what you want to put
Interesting.
on it.
Right.
I just think of Bernard Shumi's Follies. And he made this Parc de la Villette, and he designed, this Parc de la Villette in Paris.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Which, have you ever been there?
No, but I do know what you're talking about.
So good, right? So you can get on your bike and bike around, right?
Right.
And he's trying to think of the park differently in many ways. But one of the things that he did when we talk about structure this way,
right,
is he created these follies. He didn't invent the term; it predates him. But there are these constructions, they're structures, but they have no preconceived purpose. The idea is that the structures are there to support whatever purpose you put on them.
Right.
And so they build, they put cafes into it. Some of them are just open. Some of them are, somebody's offices are in one.
Yeah.
I don't actually know how they're, who decides. But I guess, on the outside, you just get to think it just naturally, emerges from the structure. And so that's the way I like to think of structure, right? It's a place of possibility in that way. So we created these structures. We would get together. I get together with a team, and so we have a participant. We make a performance for one person.
Right.
If that person is you, I study you for 6 months or more, depending on the budget. Right. That's very essential. That's an essential part of it.
Yeah.
And I study for 6 months, and my whole team studies you. We read every book you love. We read the books you hate. We talk to your friends, your family, your enemies, your lovers, your illicit lover. We go to your workplace. We, check out your closet as much as we possibly can. And then we gather all our research together, and we spend some time in retreat, hopefully as long as a week, but sometimes it's only 4 days.
Okay.
But we try to be as immersed in your information as humanly possible, right? And we know it's really working when we start to dream about you.
Okay.
Right? Then you are symbolically embedded.
Right.
And that's when our subjectivities are intermingled. And then once we get to that point, we say, what is the, I'm going to say it again, structure of experiences that we want to create for Jarrett.
Yeah.
And it's not specific. yet. Sometimes it is, but mostly it's not. We create a diagram which has an arc, an arc of experience, which we say maybe, we want him to go through deeply intellectual experience, and then deeply physical experience, and then an animalistic experience, and then an experience of being a new person. That broad.
Right. Okay.
Right? Okay. And so we're working from your experience backwards. We have actually no idea yet what media will be involved.
Right.
That's a little bit of an idealistic way of saying it.
Yeah.
We try to have no idea yet. Still, as soon as we come up with, we want him to be animal, we immediately know, that we want to do X or Y, and that comes up. Or, he's really into mapping. We need to do something with mapping, But generally, we try to create this overall arc of experience. And then we try to actually step into your subjectivity to embody what it would be to move through those. And the beautiful thing is we can do whatever we want. We can start with a novel or a poem. We can hack Wikipedia. We can make a fake New York Times review. We can put an actor into your life. All these things in order to create for you the experience of going deep into your intellect. We could have your professor, show up and talk to you about an idea, right? That's been troubling you, right? In a classroom, we could create a classroom and start a new class and have everybody in your class come because we want it to be real. Or, it could be, we could write you letters from a fictional character, or there could be a piece of music which engages your intellect in just the right way. If we know you well enough, which we never do, we know you as well as we can. We have some direction we can go to try to find that. And so that's working from your experience back to the form. And the form goes everywhere. And so we have a limited set of skills, right? If we needed a juggler, we'd have to go find one. Or, we have a composer we work with, and we are always having to find new musicians who can play what he's composing. Or, we have most of our bases covered, but once in a while we go out on our mailing list for we need a magician who works with card tricks, or something like that.
So I have a couple. I want to kind of use this structure of you creating an Odyssey for someone. This raises a lot of interesting things for me in thinking about the stuff that I've been thinking about for this podcast and this project and design in general. And so I'm not exactly sure how I want to order these questions. So I'm going to kind of, just ask you a series of questions. But, in a sense, when someone goes through an Odyssey, what you're doing, and I apologize for using this word, but I haven't thought of a better one yet, but you're almost like hacking their life for a little bit and interrupting, the course of their existence, right? For 3 days or however long, one of these would happen. How long? A couple.
Anywhere from 24 hours to 3 months.
Okay. And so, you're kind of blurring reality and fiction in their life for a while. And this is interesting to me for a couple reasons. One, it actually sounds a lot closer to how you were talking about architecture at the beginning, in that architecture interrupts or changes the environment around it, and then also who encounters it and what happens inside it and what happens outside of it. And so I'm curious how you think about the things that you've learned from kind of setting up these Odysseys and this idea of kind of interrupting or hacking reality. And I realize those are my words to describe it, but has that changed how you think about, at a small sense, buildings and architecture, but at a bigger sense, this idea of kind of reality and changing reality? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I think the reality word is an interesting word, right?
Yeah.
Because what are we talking about when we go at it from the experiential side?
Right.
Right? Because it's all real.
Yeah. Well, so let me, I don't mean to cut you off before you
Mhm.
even answer, but the thing I'm getting at is there's this kind of thing in design right now called design fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this idea of kind of using the tools of graphic design to show alternate realities or possible futures, or to kind of, design things from the future but put them into this world to show, like, if we stay on this path, this is kind of what the world would become.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting to me, but I also have a problem with calling this design fiction, because I feel like all design starts as fiction,
Mm-hmm.
and that the act of designing or the act of building or the act of making is some process of kind of turning fiction into reality a little bit.
Absolutely.
And so you're kind of doing that on this large scale where you're creating these fictions for this person, but it's changing them in a way. And in a sense, I think you could say that building does that
Absolutely.
too, and you designing a building that's constructed. And so I'm just curious how you think about.
Right. There's like a weird parallel somewhere there where, designing a building and putting it out into the world with some intention
Right.
is kind of a fiction, and the nonfiction would be a cave or something like that, right? Which just happens and you fall upon it, right? There's an intentionality behind your experience, and we experience that, or we conceive of that in most contexts as fictional.
Right.
Like you go to Sleep No More and you're not really wandering around somebody's graveyard, or it's fiction. But if we flip it around, fiction is just an attitude towards the thing that you're in front of, right? Fiction says, fiction, when I encounter something as fiction, I'm encountering it as theoretically relevant. There's a downside. It's fiction, therefore it's not real, therefore it's not pertinent to my life. On the upside, fiction is safe, so I can look at it and comprehend the overall form, the meaning, the symbolism in a way that I can't if it's real, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So reality and unreality, or reality and fiction being states of mind, we can work with them, right? And I think it happens in buildings too. Like there's a sense of going into a building and, for instance, the Jewish Museum in Berlin. Daniel Libeskind. Feels like a fiction. Walk down this hallway for 100 meters, and you will have walked down I forget what it's called, like the hallway of memory. And now, a memorial is a kind of fiction, right? You're standing in a memorial. It's not architecture with purpose.
Oh, I see. Mm-hmm.
It's an architecture with symbolic purpose, and that reads as fiction, right? Or when we go into a modernist building, that reads as truth, and that was sort of the idea of the modernist aesthetic. It is true. Look, you see the structure, and that's it. Whereas if you go to the Portland building in Portland, Oregon, which has like a big fucking, I'm sorry. we're on,
this is a radio.
We're on radio or something, which has a big bow on it. Right. That looks like fiction. It's not a package. Right. But in fact, it simply is what it is. There's a message coming across. There's an experience. If you look at it from a phenomenological point of view, right? The fiction and the nonfiction, these are simply ways of experiencing the thing that you're in. So when I do these performances, for instance, we think about when it's fiction, when it's perceived as fiction, and when it's nonfiction. And sometimes we move between them because it's simply a different effect. It changes your subject position and the way you perceive things.
Right.
And it's like, and that's a thing about design too, right?
Yeah.
When you see the design, it becomes a kind of a fiction to you.
Yes.
And when the design is invisible, it's nonfiction. Right?
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
I look at that, oh, somebody intended me to see it that way.
Right.
They're manipulating me.
Right.
That's a fiction. Or, oh, that's just the way it is. That's
Right.
just Coke.
Right.
Right.
I mean, so I this podcast is ostensibly about design criticism, and everything that you're saying is actually, I feel like, very relevant to that in thinking about something like branding, which is, a very kind of big word. But, if you think about it in the way that you're talking about encountering a building, branding, or to brand a company, is just creating a story that this company or entity is telling about itself.
Mm-hmm.
And you can approach that as, this company cares about me, they're friendly. But that was designed.
Mm-hmm.
And, that is a fiction. And, maybe it really does. Maybe it is a very friendly, helpful company. But the design around it is really just the visual design, but also kind of, the experience of going to a store, all of that is all just in service of telling that story that company or that organization or whatever wants to tell about itself.
Right.
And so when I think about criticism or how we talk about these things, those are the things that seem like actually really important.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's hard. I mean, when you put it that way, it's hard not to get really cynical.
Right,
it,
yeah.
right?
And I realized as I was saying that, I was like, oh, this is getting negative fast. But I mean, there is a positive side to it, but I know what you're
Well, what's
saying.
the positive side?
I'm thinking about this in the sense that, I don't know, maybe this isn't positive actually now that I say it. I was going to say that everybody, like, we all do this anyway. That isn't, branding is not this thing that companies do or these big kind of multinational organizations that, and this comes back to performance also, that all of us are kind of constantly enacting a type of branding or a type of performance of creating stories around ourselves as the way we want to be seen.
Mm-hmm.
And that, that comes back to performance, that comes back to storytelling, that comes back to design, and then how we relate to the world, I think, can change that also. You go into a certain building that says you have to be a certain way, and suddenly your story or your brand changes to relate to a structure or an object or something. That's or right. Another group of people.
It transforms you.
Yeah.
Its story is more powerful than yours in a way.
Yeah.
That thing that you said, that we're always creating these stories, makes it sound like we're, can I say this, all bullshitting each other all the time?
Yeah.
Right? And we are. I mean, that when you get to know somebody, it wasn't that person they presented themselves as in the first place. And yet you can look at it this other way as, I was thinking about this the other day. I was with all these people who were being so charming, right?
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
And they were so charming, and I, part of me had that cynical moment, right? It's
right.
Like, but they're just acting. They're just putting on a show.
Yeah.
And then it occurred to me how enjoyable that show was, and how much work these people were doing for my benefit.
Right.
Right? They're creating a character of themselves, making it easier for me to relate to them,
right.
Engaging, telling stories, joking, being funny in these linguistically very complex ways.
Yeah.
That are fascinating of themselves, like a free performance every single day.
Right.
Right? All this work, whereas if we don't have that, if we don't have the stories we tell about ourselves and each other, if we are not creating the experience of the other in front of us,
right.
It becomes very hard to get around. We don't know what to do. It becomes a big blank of practicalities. And to me that was the flip side. And you can extend that to design as a generous act.
Right. I mean, I guess we could say, and before we started recording, we were talking about Jessica's book about, the invention of desire. And I feel like one of the major themes of that is this idea of kind of design being an inherently empathetic discipline, and it's about, especially when the designer is working in service of someone else, it's about kind of exactly like what you do in Odyssey Works to the extreme of embodying this person to find out who they are and what intellectually stimulates them, and then creating something for them that in a weird kind of way is what designers do also.
Right. I mean, no matter what you're designing,
right,
you're designing experience.
Yeah.
Right, because at the distant end, it's being experienced.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's and we had to brand Odyssey Works.
Right.
Which was fascinating and troubling in so many ways, and I think in the end we went for something that was sort of tongue-in-cheek corporate, right?
Interesting, yeah.
Because we wanted to, which was also the name Odyssey Works, was kind of tongue-in-cheek,
right,
corporate as well.
Right.
We're the laborers of Odysseys. We're a company, and we started to have a lot of fun with it, and it was a challenge. We're like, how do we want to engage people? It forced us to think about it in really interesting ways. How do we engage people in a way where we are saying basically, we need to have a face to you, but we are uncertain about what it is, and we want to use humor in a way that's respectful. Right. So it's so interesting. And so we worked with a designer, and it was a challenge. We went through all these different iterations. And we ended up, to me, the most important part of our branding was when we were giving people titles.
Right.
Vice President of Marketing and fields. What was it? Field research. And
so you gave very kind of serious sounding, very corporate,
way too serious. And so that it was obvious that we were basically in the weeds, because we were trying to say form is uncertain for us.
Right.
And we're going to have some fun with it, but we're also going to try to be serious.
Did that process and the process of kind of studying a what do you call the viewer?
We call them participants.
The participant is the one who the performance is kind of happening to.
Yeah.
What have you learned from kind of learning how to research and embody someone else to kind of find what makes them tick to create this experience? Have you taken anything from that process into when you're designing a home for a client? Do you I guess first of all, do you still do kind of traditional architecture, and then does that kind of process, has that leaked in?
Absolutely. Yeah, I do still. I don't do a lot. I do residential designs, one project at a time. Because there's a lot of things on my plate.
Yeah.
And so it'd be hard.
We've covered that. Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be hard to focus on too many, but it also lets me focus a lot more. Well, it's like I said, this sort of emerged from architecture, but it's changed a few things.
Okay.
One thing is that in doing these interviews and this research into people, probably the most profound change in my way of seeing people that's happened is around personality and sort of deeper desires. I don't want to go all the way to saying personality and their essence or something, but their the deeper motivations. What I've seen is that over the years I've come to care less and less and less about people's personalities, less and less about people's politics, or even opinions. They're so on the surface. Yeah. They're so much a part of that performance, that branding. But still, I enjoy them. When I'm with people, I'm entertained and I'm challenged and I'm stimulated by them. But what I really seem to care about, because in Odyssey Works, those initial things don't much matter. They mostly matter as things to kind of placate and get around. You know, you got to get the right politics, or you got to get the right opinion, or you know, somebody can't stand the subway, you don't let them in the subway, and somebody thinks blue is a weird color, you don't use blue, and somebody is awed by by, you know, this particular type of sound, you use that. Those preferences are like gateways to the person. So that's changed my way of being with people and seeing people. And so I've come to see at first when I first was doing architecture, I would get things wrong. I mean, everybody gets things wrong, but
what do you mean? What do you mean, like you got?
I mean, I would design things for clients that I thought were what they wanted, and that was often because it's what they said they wanted.
Right.
And and after doing this a bunch and sort of seeing some good and some bad results, I realized that I just need to spend more time with my clients.
Right.
And get to a more sincere place, and not just approach my investigation of what they wanted verbally, because people don't actually say what they want necessarily, because in a certain way that's still part of this this superficial official thing. And so I would spend time in the home, eat, walk around the property, you know, if I can, and then start to understand, you know, how they're physically inhabiting and how they're emotionally inhabiting their space. Like, I'm designing a farmhouse right now. I mean, I've designed it; it's under construction, and it's upstate New York. It's on a biodynamic farm. And you know, a lot of our conversation was about how big of a kitchen do you want, and and the usual stuff. We need a bathroom that works for a family this big. You know, we're gonna have 4 kids. We're almost up to 3, and all those practical things. But when I spent time with them, I noticed the care with which they handled food. I mean, it's sort of a no-brainer. Biodynamic farm. They care about food. But and also the ubiquity of food. Like, they had all these mason jars of canned goods. Which is always hard to get my head around, a mason jar being canned, but I got it.
Oh, right over my head.
Right. So preserved vegetables, which were beautiful, and like they were always at the center of the table. They would come out and they would end up on the center of the table. Why? Because they loved them, and they knew they were beautiful, and I thought they were beautiful too. Right. And I also noticed that their kids were always running around in circles, and they enjoyed that. You know, some people, when their kids run around in circles, it drives them nuts. Right. But this couple, they watched their kids run around in circles, and this was a healthy thing to them. And so when I was designing it, I made sure that we got all the things that they needed, but I made a suggestion in all of my different schemes that the main thing you see when you come into the house be first the food, canned food, preserved vegetables and fruits, which would be right opposite the front entrance on shelves, and the children running in circles. Right? Because the question was, what is the heart of this home going to be?
Right.
And so we had this opposite the front door, these shelves full of these jars, and then above a walkway, a circular walkway circling the atrium. And then the kids could just run around it. And it was actually a half circle or a U originally, and the clients, they were like, oh, okay, this is what the house is going to be about. Why did you not complete the circle?
Right.
And of course they were right. So I completed the circle, and so that became
That's
probably
interesting.
the moment
Yeah.
that the house really turned into a home in
Right.
the design process.
Right. I have just a couple questions just to kind of wrap everything up, and one of them's directly related to kind of what you were just talking about. You've used the word form a lot and talked about this idea of form. And something that I'm really interested in is form as kind of being this container for ideas or larger themes more than just, in graphic design terms, more than just, a red square or a particular typeface, but that all of these things can contain these kind of bigger things. And so I just wanted to know kind of how you think about taking these ideas, taking kids running around the house or taking the way a family cares about food and turning that into form or bringing it back into this idea of an object. And kind of going back to when you were talking about studying this and learning it as creating this object and you kind of wanting to focus on these other things, how do you then turn it back into the object, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean that's the great challenge,
Right,
right?
yeah,
I mean that's the whole job,
Yeah,
I think. And because if you've only got form, you don't relate it to experience, and you
right,
fed it and become some kind of fetishized design object. And if you only have experience, you float off into the stratosphere, and nobody ever hears from you again.
right,
Really, which was the danger, which could have happened if I'd stayed with the dervishes,
right,
right?
right,
So that's it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's at the core. To me, that's the challenge, right? You want to create an experience, and you have to do this empathetic reverse engineering,
yeah,
right? How can I do that? And what is it? What are the and that's when each medium has its own demand, its own process, right? So in architecture, if you're gonna, I'm waiting for the tools, by the way, to be good enough I'm waiting for virtual reality to
right,
take over Revit, right? So
right,
if I could be designing in Revit in VR, I would be a much better designer, because right now what I have to do is I have to I sort of have to imagine the whole thing and walk into it and try and embody that experience. And then I have to see what I can do to embody that experience from the subjectivity of my client. Right?
Yeah.
And when I'm doing the
Because
Odyssey
it's not just, a building that is not just blueprints. You're not just thinking about a floor plan at that point.
Right. Right.
I didn't even make that connection. Yeah.
Right. You're thinking about the final building. This is why design technologies are so important in architecture, at least, but in everywhere, right? Because the tools limit or control or enhance your capacity to empathetically move into the space.
Right.
Right. So 3D design tools are, in many ways, better.
Right.
But in some ways,
Right.
worse, right? Because they fill it out for you, right? And this comes back to language,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
There were these languages that people invented when they were inventing languages. That there's a language called I can't remember. I think it's called Volapük. Volapük. It's almost impossible to speak because everything is exactly laid out. Right? Everything is totally clear. You know how some languages have cases that English doesn't have?
Oh, right. Yeah.
Like, for instance, when I'm saying you,
Yeah.
I mean just you, or if I'm saying you, I mean everybody in the room.
Right.
Right? But some languages have that figured out. Well, Volapük did that with every aspect of language, and it was unusable, right? Because nobody could figure it out. Whereas this kind of nuance that we have as humans to work the tools works better in kind of natural languages. To me, in many ways, AutoCAD is a better tool because it defines less. Like 3D building information tools like Revit give you too much definition, sort of like going from the book to the movie.
Okay.
Right? And so as a design process, I'd rather go with 2D or of course sketching and then go into Revit or a 3D modeling software so I can show it to my client because that helps them. But this is this is the process. This is what the tools do, and our job as designers is to be able to sort of figure out which tools are best for us because we're all a little different,
right?
And be able to master those tools so that we can get into that empathetic design mode that supersedes the tools.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then some. So then some media are not usable for some people.
Right.
Right. I mean, I can't make music.
Yeah.
But I know the effect it has.
Right.
I can ask other people to do it.
Yeah.
Who I know can. And that's where we find our place as designers, I think.
Yeah. I want to just bring writing back into this just to kind of start to kind of close it together, because I feel like that's a big part of what you do, and we didn't talk about it that much. And you have been my writing teacher for a year now, or whatever it's been, 2 years. And so this question has two parts to it. I'm curious, one's kind of a personal question and then a larger question. I'm curious how being a writer influences these other projects, and the skills and the tools of writing influence creating a performance or a building, and then also vice versa for you, how you found that those have changed you, or how does being a writer made you a different type of architect if you didn't have that set of skills. And then the second part is kind of just larger, kind of general thoughts on, you've been teaching writing to designers. How does writing help the designer, or how have you seen those kind of two fields help each other?
Yeah. I love these questions. So each tool, even though I think all tools should be applied as experience design tools, architecture, writing, graphic design, whatever, they all have different capacities. And writing, and by extension language and by extension writing, is the number one best way to convey longer, more complex ideas and narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's like bottom line. I will go to the mat with anyone who thinks they have another way. I mean, you might say film or something like that. To me, that's just writing.
Yeah, it's still
right, because it's involving language. So so most things will start there, right? But it's not necessarily the best. It's not always the only or the best way to encapsulate a single idea, right? So you can have an experience in a piece of architecture that you can't have in writing. And so they're complementary in certain ways. And they should be. They're doing different things.
Right.
And so when I create a performance in Odyssey Works, I sit down and I think, what does what, right?
Yeah.
And when do we need a longer, more comprehensible idea? And when do we need a shorter one? Okay. So from the other side, coming back, and of course, there is narrative that is relentless. It is relentless everywhere we go. It's in the building. It's in that plant behind you. Yeah. It's in your chair. Yeah. It's in the way you dress. Right? There is so much narrative, and we can hide from it, or we can embrace it. Yeah. And writing helps us to comprehend the narrative in things. Right. And whether or not we use text in combination with these other design forms, it's still the best way to understand them. I think if you go through a long design process with no writing, something is wrong. Right? Yeah. Because it's the basic format for thought. And by the way, it is the best way to think.
Right.
Because we can't think in very long sentences.
Yeah.
We get into loops, right? Writing is this miraculous tool that makes us brilliant, when before we were just, able to get out of the cave, right?
Yeah.
Writing and by extension language.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that. I think there are big problems with the way we understand writing culturally, and they are helped, ameliorated by a design approach, right? And the big problem, the simplest way to put the big problem, is that we write from the first word. We write from once upon a time to happily ever after at the end, right? And it's this direct line through what is essentially a composition, right? And that causes a lot of problems in sort of structure. And there's no reason we can't think about writing as a design process and consider consider the overall structure. And then once you do that, it's much easier to think about writing as experience design, right? And when you're there, suddenly you're not sitting there saying, oh, I have to write this way because that's the kind of writing you do for this magazine, or that's the kind of writing you do for a book, or that sounds stupid so I can't write that way, or everything has to be in the present tense because that's how you do it.
Right.
You start to think about, what is the effect of each mode of writing? What is the effect of text writing? You are cool. Right? Versus Moby Dick.
Right.
Versus, the dryness of an academic paper. Why is an academic paper dry? What is the effect of that dryness? Is it just to scare you off? Is that scaring off a kind of muscle pumping to make you feel like what's being presented is true? Right? These are ways of thinking about it that come from design.
Yeah.
Right? That come from...
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it that way before. Right?
I mean, you step into a building,
you're
not thinking... A writing thought would be, well, first you've got to put down the footings and then the wall.
Right.
But a design thought is you step into the building and you feel great because of the expansive light and the patterning on the curtain wall, which was so intelligently put together. And then you want to walk into the cathedral vestry or whatever, right? And so these have a lot to say to each other in terms of ways of thinking. And then there's the combination, because writing is physically writing is a design process. Which I think graphic designers more than anybody understand. Most writers aren't thinking of that. It's so interesting too. Once you start thinking that way, and more than reading, actually listening to people talk, because they code switch constantly code switch to match their audience, or for effect, they use present and past tense in storytelling in ways that seem to make no sense, but actually make incredible sense for emphasis. It's incredibly intelligent. People are brilliant. Almost everybody is brilliant with this stuff, and they're designing as they go for effect. And one problem with writing education is it's not thought of that way. So as soon as people get to the page, they're like, I'm doing it wrong. And they've been doing it right all along, right? So I don't know, 5-paragraph essay, I don't know, subject, and and their grammar things that they were doing so well when they spoke that once they go to the page, they screw up. Because we're thinking about writing as an object, not as a container for the experience that comes from reading it.
That's great. I love that. I actually think that that's a perfect way to kind of wrap this up. Thank you so much for this conversation, and then also just for the last year or whatever it is. I feel like your influence on this project is kind of woven throughout, and so I'm glad that we were able to I feel like I learned so much just from your classes and then also from this conversation. So I'm glad we finally got to do that. So thank you.
Well, it's my pleasure.
This was great. This episode was recorded on April 20th, 2017 in Baltimore, Maryland. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts and SoundCloud and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.